Thank you everybody for coming this evening to Middlesbrough Institute of Modern Art. As Miguel said, this is the first event in a series that are happening in institutions across the north of the UK. And I suppose the premise of the talks was to bring together artists and curators practicing in the north with also practitioners based in other European cities. And so the framework for the whole series is sort of exploring or developed from an interest in exploring ways of working outside, across, in between, and also within existing institutional structures. Whether that's, I'm thinking about the modes in which we practice and can sustain and support practice. So whether that's through institutional support structures or social networks, social relationships, and self-initiated systems of production. So with that overarching framework in mind, tonight's event at MIMA takes a theme of rethinking the institution. And this theme reflects in part the current philosophy of the gallery that Miguel has sort of mentioned, which is moving forward with a civic agenda. So the intention is to reconnect art with its social function and to promote it as a tool for changing the world, essentially. With this vision, Middlesbrough Institute of Modern Art sees itself as a useful museum, having an influence on society, taking a leading role in addressing current issues within politics, economics, and culture, and offering changing exhibitions, events, learning activities, projects, and community-focused initiatives that involve many artists and many publics. So Middlesbrough ambition is that these activities will help to shape the gallery as a public site, a site that's open and accessible, diverse and inclusive, and used by all. So our first speaker, Miguel, will talk more about the gallery's philosophy and approach. We'll then hear from Emily Hess, who's an artist based in Teesside and has worked closely with Middlesbrough Institute of Modern Art. Emily will be talking about substance, significance, and subsistence in relation to her long-term working practice with the institution. Our third speaker, Bina Choi, is director of Casco Art Institute, working for the Commons. Based in Utrecht, Casco conceives of the institution not as a singular entity, but rather as a complex web of entangled relations. And for Casco, these relations are those that strive for social change, with or in affinity with art in common. Finally, Maurice Colin is going to talk, who's an artist and co-director of Islington Mill in Salford. He'll present on his practice, which is centred upon an exploration of structures and processes, emerging from a free peer-led art school he founded in 2007, and his current project, Contemporary Custodians. So each speaker's going to talk in turn, and then there'll be a discussion between everyone and an opportunity for questions at the end of the evening. But before we begin, I'd like to thank everyone who's made today's event possible, as well as the following events in the talks programme. So Miguel and the team here at Middlesbrough, Raina and James at This Is Tomorrow, and the generous support of Arts Council England, Contemporary Visual Arts Network Northwest, Yorkshire and Humberside Visual Arts Network, North East Contemporary Visual Arts Network, and the participating venues of MIMA, Northern Gallery of Contemporary Art Sunderland, the Blue Coat in Liverpool, the Grundy Art Gallery in Blackpool, the Tetley in Leeds, and the Whitworth in Manchester. So I'll now introduce Miguel again. Miguel is senior curator here at Middlesbrough. He was the curator of the Portuguese Pavilion at the 2013 Venice Biennale. He's been a curator at Tate and Ives, England, and the Centro das Artes Visuais in Coimbra, Portugal, amongst other institutions. As a freelancer, he's curated exhibitions and projects at various institutions and events. These include Apex Art in New York, Frieze Projects at Frieze London, Art Projects at London Art Fair, and No Soul for Sale, a festival of independence at the X Initiative in New York and Tate Modern in London. He's also a critic for Art Forum, and his writing has appeared in magazines such as The Exhibitionist. There you go. Thank you.
Thank you. So, rather, yeah. So thank you so much. So I'm going to try to focus on ideas that have been shaping some of the stuff we do here, and some ideas that are my understanding of the stuff we do here, or my understanding of what curating should be today. I'm not going to illustrate it with projects that we've done here. It would sound a little bit self-promotional, too much self-promotion to actually go through the projects, etc., etc., etc. Some of you are familiar with them, some might not, but I think the relevance of today is to actually have the opportunity to share thoughts and hear from others and see how sometimes we are working in parallel narratives which have points of convergence and points of dissonance. So I always start by talking about politics rather than art, which is a good way of introducing ourselves in Middlesbrough. And I usually say today that we have this specter haunting us, which is no longer the specter of communism, as it was written in 1848 by Marx and Engels. Speaking about Engels, you can see him, or some of his writing in the current exhibition, The Housing Question, part of a larger program around housing and home, ideas of home, that we currently have on display. And the specter is the specter of neoliberalism, from which the current populist drive being represented essentially by, let's say, Trump and Brexit is a sub-product. So these two gentlemen and lady are the fathers of the current situation in which we live, and they are the iconic figures of the reintroduction of neoliberal agenda within the Western world, let's say, in the late 70s, early 80s. And basically, this neoliberal agenda created this health pyramid in which you have, let's say, the 1% accumulating most of the wealth of the world against the 99% which doesn't accumulate it. And this actually is not just about the globe, it's about the locale. The same happens in Middlesbrough, in the Tees Valley, in the north, in England, in the UK, and in Europe and beyond. So the question I usually ask facing this situation, and usually if I was not in Middlesbrough, if I was elsewhere, I would now introduce a little bit more the context from which we operate in Middlesbrough, which might be familiar to some of you, might be less, but Middlesbrough is basically one of these places in the UK that is usually associated with all the negative statistics you can imagine. And is very well known for its social deprivation quality. So usually I ask what is to be done. And what is to be done is is basically a quote of this famous book by Lenin, which was one of the foundational texts of the Russian Revolution, of which we are celebrating the 100th anniversary this year. And basically, quoting this book, or quoting a revolutionary idea, it represents a call to action. So the work I try to do and we try to do here is embedded in this kind of idea of action rather than something else. Alistair Hudson, the still current director of this museum, actually once said we should not be called the Institute of Modern Art, we should be called an Institute of Modern Action. Let's see if we can keep that vein. So the question is exactly that, what is to be done? And there are two options we can follow. One is business as usual and align ourselves with the 1%, which here is represented within the museum sector by the Guggenheim, and all the system of philanthropy and the private sponsorship that basically has hijacked the art world and has led the art world to its current state, or part of the art world, let's say, or we can align ourselves with the 99%, those that protest against the status quo. And actually, these pictures are very Western. They represent Occupy movements in New York, but hopefully there would be other intellectual frameworks from which we could draw similar ideas and similar images rather than those that are just so familiar to us. So translating that into what we do here, we should follow business as usual or challenge the status quo. And I think we are challenging the status quo. How? By operating for others. Actually, I missed the slide here now. I'm sorry. But usually from this slide, I go into a slide in which you show the picture of MIMA, and there is a young family couple, heterosexual, very British normative kind of, which then we say that represents the status quo, and this would be the challenge. And I don't know why, I think it was when I was putting my slides into your slides. But I can go back, collect my laptop, and then show it after. So basically, this is a picture of our first iteration of what has become one of our signature style projects called Cloth Club, which is part of our community day. And this is a picture of a project we commissioned to an artist here. And they represent an approach, a museum practice that somehow tries to engage with those that represent the other, and they are the others at Middlesbrough, but they are the other in general. And they are the non-typical museum goers, the non-typical demographics that we encounter across the UK when we are talking about museums. So usually, this is a slide I usually use to basically try to explain where we were and where we want to be. 2007 was when the gallery opened to the public, and 2017 is today. The expressions in quotes are actually expressions taken from the mission statement that was in place here at the time and until a couple of years ago. So, leading gallery, and interestingly, all galleries in the UK call themselves leading, which is by itself impossible to be. And then this other very important expression, the mission was to bring world-class art to Middlesbrough or the region. Yeah? I usually also ask what does it mean to be world-class, and then people say it's great art, and then we can ask what great art is, and then we can go on and on and on. So basically this represents marketing language, corporate language, being infiltrated into mission statements of art galleries and museums, which is just a symptom of the way things operate today. At the time, of course, the building was quintessential, and again, when we see presentations similar to this one, there's almost no director or chief curator or whatever that works in a museum that doesn't start by showing the building. Yeah? So deliberately, we don't show the building here. We show activity, something else, and etc. Crucially, MIMA was, and let's say we need to be fair with those that initiated MIMA and continued MIMA until today, would operate within the art system, like everyone else. So all this stuff, and then finally, quite important, but less relevant to our discussion, was the fact that most of the content that was presented here was not locally generated, it was generated elsewhere. So on the other side, you have everything we were trying to be. We want to be an open space that is no longer just a gallery or a museum, and this in definition is even represented in our name, Institute. Even within staff, we have different expressions to name ourselves. Even others that name us call us different things. So to try to use a term that can somehow circumvent that, it's important to us. We want to really work locally, but by working locally, that doesn't mean that we are following an isolationist agenda, saying that whatever happens here is the only thing that is relevant. So basically, what happens here has to do with what happens elsewhere. Focus on people, focus on civic engagements through what we call constituent building. So no longer speaking about audiences as like this mass or this abstraction, but really talking about individuals and groups with whom we work and collaborate and build, and through them shape, or with them shape what we do. And most importantly, to achieve this, the content now is generated here. In a nutshell, we see ourselves as a public resource that repurposes art as a tool towards community building that might lead to social change. And we use this terminology called useful, which we borrowed, or Alistair borrowed from Art Util movement, and applied into the museum context. There will be much more to talk about these kind of things. We can have that time. But basically, here then, you have a highlight of some ideas that manifest what I just said. So we focus on activity and not just on display. We work with constituents, not just audiences. We really try to work in a way that is what now has been called in the UK co-creation. So basically collaborating with others in shaping the projects and our identity. A lot of that has to do with self-generation content, user generation. So our projects and identity is generated by our users rather than just by us. And by that we achieve what we call redistribution of authorship. So no longer a single authorial voice, but a much more disseminated way of creating what we do. Where does this come from? Long story short, art for a reason, not for its own sake. So the autonomy question, art has been since Kantian aesthetics and probably around that time, that the development of art as an autonomous sphere it was initiated and was really strongly developed across the 20th century. So there is an alternative understanding of art, which is this postulated, for instance, by someone like John Ruskin, which is very familiar in the UK, which has to do with the relation of art to use. So this is a quote from Ruskin. We don't need to really read it all, but basically try to understand art as a way of contributing to the requirements of life. And again, in art history, we always have had this contradiction between art and life, and there has been all sorts of avant-garde movements across the 20th century that try to dissolve this binary or this border or this junction. And apparently it's still very relevant, and it's actually still very relevant today. And we just need to think about, for instance, when the referendum around the leave or permanence of the UK within the European Union, there was a huge discussion around whether, for instance, museums should have a stance on this, should have an opinion, should actually make it public. Why? Because, in principle, we are neutral, objective organizations separated from politics, which, for instance, is exactly what we're trying to avoid here. I quite remember Alistair actually posting something on Twitter about it and making it really significant. In terms of the relation of art to use, a good example is this picture of Ruskin with his students, instead of in the studio painting, building a road. So basically art becomes a tool to talk about or to address or to challenge or to contribute to something that is beyond the art sphere itself, the art world itself, and now starts to be related more to the social world. What we try to say here is that this is not very much unique to today, just checking my time. It's not very much unique to today, although might have had a resurfacing or might start to have some power within discourse and in practice today, but it's part of a longer narrative of subaltern practices within art, which I call art without art. So in which art is separated by art as we understand it within the aesthetic field. And this is basically the counter-narrative towards dominant mainstream art history and museum practice that has been in place. So here you have the art util movement, but you have other things from the Mechanics Institute to Bauhaus or to Tatlin in Soviet Union, a text around usership by Stephen Wright. The concept of use value against exchange value is actually a Marxist concept. So this is my notes from a conference by a famous Marxist philosopher called it in Bolivar. I don't know how to say her name properly in Dutch, but Jana van Heesijk, the Blue House, it's also a very important project, social turn, etc. So museums that are trying to operate today or institutions in this vein, basically they follow a trajectory of what has been named the new institutionalism, which you can see there, which is this drive in the 90s towards a situation in which gallery spaces become open spaces, part community center, part laboratory, part research, part display, part production. And to conclude, this leads us to an alternative art world, or a way of working differently from the mainstream. These two books are by a man called Gregory Cholette, actually an artist, writer from New York, but he basically talks about dark matter, this idea that there is a subterranean art world that actually feeds the mainstream art world, but it's an art world that is invisible, where labor is not properly paid. And to give a simple example, interns working for free, underpaid people, people working XX time, that all contributes to the economy of the art world as we know it, but is what constitutes this dark matter. And basically is postulating an alternative to this. The art world uses the language of social justice while remaining faithful to capitalist principles. And these are those that still sustain the system as we know it. So to conclude, usually then I quote or I borrow a quote from this book by these men called Stefan Arne and Fred Moten, and they talk about university, which was still seen as like the refuge of the intellectual worker. But the university, particularly in the UK, has also been hijacked by a corporate mentality. So borrowing from them and replacing the word university by museum, what we advocate, or I try to advocate, is the only possible relationship to the museum today is a criminal one. From the museum, we need to steal. And this is a metaphor. From the museum, we need to steal what? Well, we need to dismantle the museum as it has been established and create an alternative system or model for it. And by that, to conclude, I borrow that expression, the undercommons, and I'm looking forward to hear Bina talking about the name changing of Casco to a name in which the word commons is become a titular, part of it. But basically, the social divide has produced a group of people today that for whom civil rights seem to not apply. So they are no longer part of the commons because they are not even entitled those rights that the commons are entitled to, even if only formally. They are the undercommons. And I use this in a very Marxist way. So they are the underclass. And I believe that we today need to work for them. Curating has to do with them. Must relate to the undercommons. So curating is a way of working towards, in terms of current urgencies. And we see curating in this way, I see curating that way as an organic intellectual practice. This is actually another Marxist concept, but basically in the early 20th century, the organic intellectual, according to this man called Gramsci, was the one that could create a situation that would enable a contribution from an intellectual worker to social change. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Miguel. So I'll just introduce Emily Hess now, who's going to talk next. Emily has practiced as an artist since 2006, although she didn't undertake an arts education in the traditional sense. So her interdisciplinary practice questions and aggravates social and political power dynamics through regional folk histories, collective action, and the use of land and its associated materials as a physical form of protest. She's currently co-director of New Linthorpe, which is a long-term artwork which utilises Teesside's ceramic heritage to initiate co-authored projects that foster social change. Her recent solo exhibitions include Stand 2016, so running to be Labour's candidate for Tees Valley Metro Mayor, and the Coffee House and Post-Brexit Paradox, both of which were at Middlesbrough Institute of Modern Art. And Emily's also exhibiting in the current show at the moment, Idea Home Show. So I'll pass you over to Emily. Oh, you're there. I couldn't see you. Where you were. You're lost. Sorry.
Right. Hi, everyone. I'm going to be... Okay. So my presentation today is entitled Substance, Significance and Subsidence, the Institution Without Borders. I'm going to be showing you a lot of images today of the projects that I've done here with MIMA over the last few years, but I will be talking about our ongoing relationship, the relationship I've had with the gallery since July 2015. So, substance. I work with land. I say that I work with land and not with clay or not with earth or dirt or anything else because I don't just work with the material but with the idea of the landscape itself and that which resides upon it, within it, its past and its future. So physically working with what is underlying in the idea of clay, but metaphorically, as Laura mentioned, using the landscape itself as a physical form of protest. This area particularly struggles with its regional identity, the identity of the people that are from here, like myself, who was born in Middlesbrough. And one of the reasons I work with the land is to look at and readdress this balance of mistold histories or people that have been omitted from our history here. So, this is New Linthorpe, and this project now in the Arte Utile archive. This is the card. I'm not going to talk much about it because there's enough about it online and other places, but this was really the project that began my relationship with MIMA in July 2015 when the project was launched. This is a co-authored work. It was initiated by myself and former MIMA curator James Beaton, but worked with the people and the communities of Teesside in many different forms, but looking at how we could use and reclaim our land in some way. So people were given some ownership, even if that was just by making a pot, a cup, or having just the discussion around what it meant to actually own a piece of land. And at this point, I worked out this morning, when I was thinking about just what I've done with MIMA and the team and how long I've been working here now, that this is my 69th interaction or intervention with MIMA. So in way of talk, workshop, conference, lecture, commission, project. That's not all the days that I worked on those projects. That's just when I stood here and presented to an audience or group of people or the community. So I was quite amazed by that. And yeah, this is my present work, which is downstairs in the gallery at the moment. So one of the ways that I have worked with MIMA is that they've given me this platform on which to work. So I often will just come up, one idea will come out of another work, or somebody will, from within the community or the locality, will comment on another need that they have, maybe in relation to a current work, and that's then just built upon, and that's now how my practice operates. I can talk to you more about this work later on, but as I say, I'm just skipping through. So the significance. So the significance of my practice in relation to the way in which the museum chooses to operate and its ethos. So my practice involves a deep and attached understanding of this landscape, its people, and its history. Essentially, I aim to be what is an authentic voice within a marginalized community. So I advocate for those that feel they cannot speak for themselves in this relationship with the institution. And MIMA's provided me, as an artist, a trusted and supported platform in which to rethink our local identity. And we do this in a co-authored fashion here, where, as the community, are always welcome to join in the discussions and be part of them. So one of the ways that MIMA's really assisted in building that relationship, I just want to show you these slides, which are actually kind of a series of transformations in both through time, but also in thinking. So this was originally, as I told you, the New Linthorpe project was based around a historical pottery, the Linthorpe pottery, which existed in Middlesbrough from 1879. And this was the women's decorating room. So one of the first projects that I did here with MIMA was for the exhibition Localism, and it was this work, Common Ground. But I took that idea of the workshop at a time when people remembered, everybody in this town knows what Linthorpe pottery is. It was not a difficult conversation to have with everybody artistically. It was easily communicatable and accessible to people. So actually turning this into a work of contemporary art wasn't really that difficult for anyone to understand. And actually what was even better about that was the involvement that people then wanted to have in the work. And that's something that I've been able to use the gallery as a real sort of test bed for my own practice as well. So for me personally, that's hugely beneficial, but it's also hopefully really I think it has benefited communities here as well from the feedback that we've got. So, subsidence. So actually this idea of a sort of our relationship being almost akin to a geological event which causes a shift in the Earth's surface in some form was quite interesting to me when I was thinking about how I was going to present this work to you. It's actually the first time I've ever spoken about the relationship that we have. We normally just speak about the projects. So our thinking artistically and institutionally has become more aligned over time, and responding to current urgencies, which is important to both of us, both locally, nationally and internationally, the work has begun to cause shifts in thinking about the land itself and its people by local authorities, by decision makers, by other institutions within the region. And this idea that, as Miguel said, we have actually been able to act through our collaborative processes, both supporting each other. And in some ways, when I was thinking about this yesterday, these shifts or moments of subsidence won't ever happen again in the same form. The models of working practice we've adopted can be used elsewhere. And I'm most interested, though, in these dents we've left behind in the local cultural and institutional landscapes. And that I feel it's these moments of fracture that have assisted, I hope, and that they'll agree, the team here at MIMA to help remove the border between the institution and the community outside that it serves. So the one project that I'm going to talk about is one that is one that is just in its really early stages of development, because our working together has really built this, or shown this sort of this new ability for artists to work with an institution, and we've seemed to have formed this level of trust that other people are now responding to. And recently I received a request from Australia, actually, from an artist over there from Middlesbrough who's been working with the Noongar Aboriginal tribe. And they believe us here from Middlesbrough to be Cook's people, as this is where Captain Cook was from. And they would like, basically, some assistance in retelling their story correctly, and how we then start telling their story correctly, which at the moment, I must say, is being pretty badly told. So this is now a project that, which I will be starting with MIMA and also hopefully with Middlesbrough Council. But these are the words that I received from them, and then this is what we are now forming our project around. So I'll just read it to you. The land is not separate from the sky or sea, communal dreaming. Ghosts arrive as agent for God's king. Terra nullius and other lies. Slave shaped slave. Collaboration between the Noongar Bibbulmun people and the tribe from the middle place near the snake goddess Tess, known as Middleburg. When the English white ghost brought his words, we kept our stories locked inside. Land is not a separation from the sea. Do the middle people still know their ancient stories, or are they unlike us? Did they travel and separate from country? Art from the earth, sea and sky. Bush tucker from the hills and streams. Soil and foliage will shape this work. Light will show us where dark hides. The children will share across water and land new truths. A chance to meet in the liminal moment. Dance will be captured by day and night. Words will be our words. Thank you.
So I'll just introduce Bina Choi, who's director of Casco Art Institute, working for the Commons. Casco exists in Utrecht, working across art and academia and alongside many peer arts institutions, so art and design schools, activist groups and other organisations. In her role at Casco, Bina conceived and co-developed with the team and numerous others a long-term and composite artistic research project, Grand Domestic Revolution, and the 3-year interdisciplinary and artistic research programme Composing the Commons, which has been part of the faculty of the Dutch Arts Institute and Masters of Fine Arts programme in Aarhus. She works for and with a trans local network, Arts Collaboratory, and Cluster, a network of European arts organisations focusing on art and its context.
Hi, thank you very much for having me. This is my first visit to Northern England. It has been so far very inspiring. I think main inspiration is about the convergence. So we feel like, like Miguel also told me that it is strange that I came here. It is maybe strange that I'm from South Korea and then now I'm working in Utrecht in the Netherlands already nearly 10 years. But I see so much mirroring. So in fact, every meeting like this is so important. And that also makes me think what actually I should talk with you. So please bear with me if I am searching instead of going on with a slide that I prepared. So, well, this is first, maybe I just go along with a slide with a very short comment, but then I like to make some link with what I just saw downstairs, and then some connection in relation to what previous, Eva and Miguel spoke about. So this is an image from our previous, the last show, called Casco Art Institute, Working for the Commons. So we are in time of transition. So our name, now we have many names: Casco, Casco Project, Casco Office for Art Design and Theory, and Casco Art Institute Working for the Commons. So we're going to be more fundamental in insisting the last name, Casco Art Institute Working for the Commons, from spring next year. And before doing that, we use an exhibition as a test site and ground for feedback. So this image coming from this exhibition. And what you see in the panel is a process continuous changing, which shows a diagram of working mechanism of the network called Arts Collaboratory, which we are part of. It's a network of 25 art organizations, most of which located in so-called Global South. More to come later. And then this image that you see in the middle is the work by Mazolin Dijkman called The Composition of the Universe. It's a sculpture, but it's also toys. So actually anyone can come and touch, and very suitable for children, but as well as adults. But this actually the representation of the universe in which we are situated in. So what you can see here, different circular shape of different color. And can you see the green dot? That's actually what we are made of, called ordinary matters. All the rest, like dark matter, dark energy, are what making up the universe. So the Earth is just this tiny bit of this universe. And we thought this work provide an image of the commons, an attitude toward the commons. So we as just small part of what is already given, that is always in becoming. And this is the image of our board meeting, which you can see Charles Escher, who has been here a few times, as I heard, on the work of artist Reed Winan that made in collaboration with us. So this is the a table with it's called the disposition table. Part of the series of the work by Reed called a conversation series. Idea is to classify the working material behind exhibition phase of Casco. So like basically organizational matter, including our like theoretical matters, planning matter, but also like daily working documents. These include the image here, which is not so legible, unfortunately, here, but this is like a map of, or a diagram of the commons, so like notion of commons and different strategies that we map out during the process of our research on the commons. So like commons is kind of like complex concept, but one way of approaching it is like 4 categories as given by Michel Bowen. So there's a nature commons, which this composition of universe, this work could say about. So like air, land, sea, all these natural commons, and the social commons. So form of cooperation that are very diverse, that are also part of really daily life. And other knowledge commons, which has been emerging as a basis of this capitalist society, mediated by digital technology. And final one is urban common. So this image shows one of our future or dream project. So this is the image of a farmhouse that's surrounded by the housing complex, part of expanding city of Utrecht, whose size similar to Tesse, this region somehow. And this farmhouse is under great dispute because formerly it was like that. So it's an image of the 97. So it was like whole area was farm, and this farmhouse is owned by a farmer called Case. He was forced, or he had to sell his farm, except the farmhouse. But there's a complication in the deal between the farmer Case and the city council and then developer. So he's under huge debt, 2 million euros. So he's on dispute, nothing is developing in this farmhouse. And by working for the commons, we want to take this farmhouse as one of the important sites for our engagement. It will be important also in the level of formation of living commons or social commons. So there's no one in this area who live longer than like 15 years. So everyone is new, and there's no art center. So there are like few associations. So we hope that this could be a place for a gathering, for example. So, okay, time-wise, I used 80 minutes, correct? So I have a few more minutes. So this image or this graph, maybe it can be coupled very well with this pyramid image that Miguel showed. And these are just few graphs published as a part of the article called The Great Acceleration. And what it shows is the degree in which things were produced, extracted, and how Earth is responding to. What is so striking is that just after 1950, that the degree of production and use and extraction escalating. And Earth is responding to that. So we see we cannot ignore the correlation between these two. So like this recognition of Earth system, somehow we think we can support with image like the one that I showed, the composition of the universe. So this is the a few diagrams that show more concretely how we want to change the way that we are working. In fact, like this difference that Miguel showed of the MIMA's development between 2007 and 2017, and I think if we can, Casco can be almost identified with MIMA. So again, this kind of convergence or mirroring taking place in periphery of the world, I would say. And that's where the change taking place, it looks like. So what it shows here, this is the way that we diagram our operation before. It adopted this like iceberg model. So what is visible on the top and what is not at the bottom. So visible is program and some of the mediation program, but then whole process of production, dealing with the infrastructure and relational matters. And then our team, labor. So we were already growing consciousness of this like visible and invisible realm of our operation and what serve what, and it becomes like this. So, so what is on the top is assembly. So we exercise the form of assembly as a part of this network, Arts Collaboratory. So these happen in kind of transnational scale, like representative, or it's not they represent, but 2 members of 25 organizations gather together to learn from each other, but also to make decisions in order to transform their way of working together. And out of that kind of 4 years of learning on learning process through the assembly, now we want to do within our local context. So like MIMA, that one of our joy and also mission was to gather a heterogeneous group of practitioners. So utopian movement was when different groups occupying our space and having their own deliberation and work, but then also come together. And how to sustain that. That's like one of the main interests to organize assembly. Let them converge and see each other and develop or grow the possibility or collective possibilities. And then next to that, we want to see exhibition as a form of assembly. But it's not like everyone coming together just throw the work. So it would be like slow process of reconceiving the exhibition. So we start going to invite a few groups who have been using Casco, with whom we have been working together to contribute to the exhibition. Eventually, maybe exhibition could be important means of communicating and dwelling for the assembly. And then other one is embedded exhibition, meaning that while conceiving exhibition as an assembly, next to assembly, we want to go out more. So exhibition in other contexts. If we are dealing with image of alternative economy as our subject, then we want to go into the place where that question is where that question directly matters. And in also we kind of set a certain guideline for planning our activities. So that consists of 3 axes. So body, action, kira kira. So action is to think of what is the goal. In the effort of being specific as much as we can. And that necessarily entails also what are the strategies for that action. And body is the question of labor and subsistence. So how are you going to sustain that action? How are you going to develop that strategy? With whom? So there should be always correlation between this body and action. So like question of a body can reduce scale of action, or ambition of action actually can enforce you to deliberate further on what could be your body and how you manage your body. So like kind of old labor question come into play here. But then next to that, we also want to have kira-kira moment, meaning kira-kira. So actually meaning of this kira-kira is not so important. That's the core of this. So like connecting with the Undercommons, this book that Miguel introduced, there is emphasis on what is called like study moment or mode of study. So what they say is that ironically in the university we cannot study any longer. Similarly, within an art institution we cannot deal with art any longer. So there is a kind of production mechanism. There is a kind of regime of service delivering and meeting that service. But kira-kira is to allow, always ask, are we studying? We have this moment of speculating together and learning from each other. And there should be also joy, like joy from working and learning together. So these three axes will be very important in commoning or planning towards working on the commons. I will skip this. So this is like last image, which we use metaphor of sun, of the way in which Cusco is formed. So I don't know what Ninabel is the kind of name of our team. When we were very much under the illusion of developing ourselves as a collective. But we are out of that, that vision. But still, this memory of possible collective out of institutional team is important. That is always in situation of the communities and network in broadly ecosystem. And those are what we are focusing on. By believing it, those are actually making public and publicness. So we are not ignoring, or we are not excluding the public, but we see the public as effect of this focus. So I think I didn't manage to improvise too much, but maybe I bring up more in the discussion. We're going to have a discussion later, right? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Pinna. So I'll now introduce Maurice Colin. Maurice is an artist and co-founder of Islington Mill in Salford, but he's also the recipient of the first ever CLAW Visual Artists Fellowship from the CLAW Leadership Programme. As part of the fellowship, he's written a series of provocations for AN magazine, where he's questioning the relationships and dominance of the established arts infrastructure in the UK on the development, support and sustainability of artists' individual practices. Continuing a question of structures for support, ownership and dissemination of artists' work, his current project, Temporary Custodians, entails an installation of over 100 relief prints that are jointly owned by a network of custodians who have an opportunity to decide upon the future of the installation over the 10 years of the project period.
Thanks, Laura. It's not me. Yeah. Thank you, Laura, and thanks to Miguel, Emily, and Bina for your presentations. They were really great. I'm looking forward to the discussion that we're going to have afterwards. Just wanted to reflect for like a little moment on the theme that that we have tonight, the rethinking the institution. I think there was a subtext to that was about exploring alternative structures for engaging with contemporary art, and I'm going to be focusing on that part more. That's really more my interest, actually I think we do a lot of rethinking of institutions, and often they don't really change that much. So maybe we could spend more time working on alternatives. So I want to talk about a project that I've been working on for the past couple of years called Temporary Custodians. It's essentially an idea to reimagine what it means to own and be the custodian of artworks. And for me, what I'm really interested in is moving away from a value system that I see as being very much about like a kind of singular possessive ownership, and into something that's more plural, that's more about taking part and joining in. And generally, as an artist, I'm interested in how we could develop a more balanced relationship between artists and those who support their work. But just briefly, a couple of things to mention that have kind of informed my thinking for the Temporary Custodians project. One of which is my background. Before I became an artist, I was part of the DIY music scene in Manchester as a musician, but also like a promoter and running a small record label. And I think what I really loved about being part of that community was the ability to have a kind of direct and relationship of equivalence with the people who supported my work, so the people who bought the records and came to the gigs. And so far I haven't really experienced that in the art world, and for me the relationship in the art world often seems to be kind of based on a kind of power over structure rather than a power with. And I think this, you know, we could do with looking at how we might want to change that. The other thing I wanted to mention is my art education. I've not been to art school. I've not been to university either. I set up my own art school at Islington Mill in 2007. There was lots of reasons for that. Not least that tuition fees had been introduced, and I wanted to question the value of mainstream university-based art education. But one of the, I guess being a mature student, I ended up having lots of conversations with the tutors. And one of the things I really learned from them was, they talked a lot about the kinds of pressure they were under to make sure that we all, as foundation students, moved on to degree courses, regardless of whether we were suited for it or not. And I think I learned something at that moment about how potentially narrow the pathways to developing a career as an artist are, and in some ways perhaps how limited the notions of success might be, and how those very limited ideas of what a successful artist might be are kind of fixed really early in education. So the artwork that led to the Temporary Custodians project is this series of work that I was producing from 2013 called Performance Publishing. I've always been really excited by self-publishing and just kind of this idea of how you can use like really cheap and available materials and processes to put something out into the world, and also to operate within a kind of circulation system that does offer the potential for a kind of exchange between equivalents. And as part of the art school, I'd been making lots of flyers and posters and books. What I wanted to do was to see if I could translate those ideas within self-publishing and printing and translate them into space and think about how they might be scaled beyond the book form, if you like. So the performance publishing, where they were self-initiated projects, where I was working in these large-scale industrial buildings, taking large one-to-one scale relief prints, rubbings of the floor surface, and publishing them as they were being produced live via an internet live stream. It was the works for me were about referencing the history of self-publishing. So the rubbings themselves were a reference to the first known form of publishing. That was ancient Chinese stone rubbings. So that was where anyone with access to paper could take copies of inscriptions cut in stone and distribute them throughout China, and coincided with the invention of paper. And I was overlaying that ancient form of self-publishing with its contemporary equivalent, which is live streaming. I guess there was also something for me about working on the floor and this idea of horizontal space, and so the project became an opportunity to kind of open the space for lots of other events to happen alongside them. So the art school would have crits there, and there would be potluck dinners and various other kinds of events. When the performance publishing period would end, there would be a period of exhibition where the rubbings installations that I created would then be exhibited, and they were like a real contrast with the liveliness of the energy of the performance publishing part beforehand, and there was a kind of stillness and a peacefulness to these installations resting in these huge echoey buildings that I really loved. But I also started to really think about what it is that gives an artwork life, and started to reflect on the entire life cycle of an artwork and what that might look like, and began to think a little bit about why we as artists put an awful lot of energy into the production and the first exhibition of artworks, and then sometimes we kind of just abandon them a little bit. And I wanted to think about how I could apply creativity to how an artwork finds its way into the world. And with these works, I was really interested in how they, as being kind of rooted in this idea of performance, how they could continue to perform in the world in some way. So there was a couple of 3 or 4 things that I just briefly wanted to mention that informed the temporary custodians' ideas. Some of them you might be aware of. This is an image from a picture loan library. So these were post-war lending libraries that were quite common in museums, where you could borrow an original artwork in the way you might borrow a book. There's a handful of them still kind of in existence, but not really. This is Paul Baran's idea for a distributed network. So an idea for a communication system that could withstand a nuclear attack. It was developed in the 1960s and then became the blueprint for the World Wide Web. And then more recently, something I was looking at was community share offers. So where a community of people could come together and raise money through a share offer to keep an asset of community value, like say a local pub or a shop, so they could keep it open. And they, as a shareholder, you receive a social dividend rather than a financial dividend. So the idea is that you want to see this thing happen. You don't necessarily expect to get your money back, although if it does turn a profit, then you could do. So the first temporary custodians work was launched last year. It is an installation of 100 rubbings of the 5th floor surface of Islington Mill. The offer to be a custodian was about becoming a custodian through taking ownership of of a single print and becoming like a fractional owner of the entire installation. But it was also an offer to participate in a community of co-owners over a 10-year period to explore what that might mean, and then at the end of that 10-year period to decide the future of the entire artwork. And whether it would ever come together again as a complete installation will be the decision of that group of people. I just realized this video isn't working, so that it's supposed to be it's an animation of the 5th floor surface and the all right. Oh, we've got to just. There we go. So it's so it gives you an idea of how the 100 prints emerged in layers of CMYK inks over the period of the production. And I guess the other thing I wanted to say was that the offer to the temporary custodians is to consider what else they as a group of people might want to do. Could they buy other artworks in this way? Could they create a new form of public collection that's distributed across a city rather than being centrally held by an institution? Could they create a new kind of context for artists to make work for? And in return for their investment, it will contribute to the refurbishment of this space. So this is a currently derelict space at Islington Mill, and the money raised through the sales of the work will contribute to that space being brought back into use as a residency and production space for artists. So where we are at the moment is we have 80 out of the 100 temporary custodians signed up. We had a handover event at home in Manchester to distribute the first group of prints to their custodians, and we are working with a group of digital developers and sociologists to develop a digital platform to show those works in their context in the homes and offices and workplaces of the custodians, and we're really interested in how other people who have artworks in their homes might join that, and how it could potentially become a new kind of distributed public collection. And just finally, I'd really want to say, if anyone is interested in any of these ideas, we're very open to your contributing in whatever way you see fit. Okay, thank you.
Something that's really struck me through listening to all the presentations is that I think there's a common theme on not just using art as a tool for either engagement or facilitating social relations, or perhaps making those relations more robust, but also the idea of caretaking. And it just got me thinking about like the root of curating. The term curating is to care. And the idea of caretaking in curating not just for objects, but caretaking in terms of taking care of communities or the relationships you're building with others through your practice. So it's not really a question, but it's a comment. And I thought maybe, Miguel, you might have something to say about caretaking.
It's a good, I mean, it's a good image or metaphor that you are using. The roots of the word curating in Latin has, as you said, it has to do with caring for something, and we usually associate it caring for objects. And this is how, let's say, the practice has been shaped across since the invention of the museum, let's say, or even before with Cabinet of Curiosities, and even before, but I'd say in the modern museum, in the modern library in the 19th century. And those institutions were actually created for the commons, for the people, you know, like transition with the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and the creation of what became known at the time as the bourgeoisie and the workers, and the need to remove those objects from where from the sites where to which they belonged at the time, which were the church and the palace of the kings, and make them available, and the development of a public sphere. And with that came the education, the real education that was needed, the real knowledge that was needed for workers, etc. So I think it's actually in the inception of the word that the idea of a community or people is already present, but somehow has been obliterated by, well, maybe speculating now by this drive of autonomization of art that actually has to do with the need that the bourgeoisie felt at the time to legitimize itself as a class. So yeah, it's quite an interesting metaphor looking back today, how you can actually see the looking after something being engaged with someone. And the more we consider the involvement of others in the making of what we do, others being the others, the people, I think the more relevant is our work.
Yeah, I think that is interesting, Laura. And when I was talking about temporary custodians in the States, someone mentioned to me that the word custodian actually means someone who literally is the cleaner of the building, so someone who actually cares for it in a very real sense. And yeah, I guess I was just thinking about a few things about who it is that does the caring, and I think that often that I've found in artist-led communities that it's often the artists that are doing all of the work, and often I think in doing that we shut out a lot of people who are actually interested in being part of those communities. And one of the things that I'm kind of interested in is how we can kind of sort of level the field again. One of the things I really learned with the Temporary Custodians project is that there's a lot of people out there who want to be part of an artistic community, but they don't necessarily identify as an artist or a curator or any of the roles that we kind of have that are fairly fixed. So I think that I think I'm really up for the caring, but I want to share it.
Wait, there are so many attached to the word care, but I'm so careful about using the word care because I also saw many occasions how that word is appropriated in order to demand that is not possible in the regime of patriarchy. So like this notion of like a slow institution or slowing down, I think we need kind of elaboration on all these kind of new values that we were old and new, but different value that we are working on. So in terms of like care, that I also like to connect with cleaning, which like the team at Costco have been grappling with. in a very real term. So like we have been cleaning together every Monday for like 30 minutes since 2014. And we started that exercise as a part of the like kind of project called Site for Unlearning Art Organization, together with artist Annette Krauss. And this cleaning was one of the exercise to unlearn an institutional habit that we wanted to unlearn together. That was like productivity. So we were realizing that we constantly undermining like reproductive time, like even the time for saying hello, especially on Monday, when we have like piles of email that we need to respond. Or like we do say at the end of the day when we had a lot of meetings that we say we didn't do anything. Because that's like relational, and then we need to do something to complete and create a certain object or product. Then we say we've done work. So that's kind of what we call like productivity regime, and to unlearn that regime, we started cleaning. So I feel like cleaning is not a form of art. Art without art. So like the care, I think, coming with not only doing service for our communities, but like somehow like unlearning a system in which we are so used to, that create this kind of horrible condition that we are living in, but which we cannot really embrace on daily basis because it may be too horrible or like hard to anticipate. I'm talking about like ecological crisis. So like I also see so many people are coughing these days, and sometimes I think, oh, it has to do with the change in the air, and then like change in the process of endemics, etc. So that's my take on care.
How progressive is an institution in which staff collectively clean the building? I mean, I'm humbled by hearing this.
Well, I'd just like to say that I think cleaning is labor, and labor is a very important part of making art.
But just to conclude, actually, I'm also I love the metaphor that you used, but I struggle a little bit, and I think it has to do with something you said. I struggle a little bit, or even been there is always the looking after or the caring. Somehow still represents a relationship of power, and I struggle a lot with that. And so we need to still be aware of an agenda that is even when we say. Replacing objects by people, there's still an agenda that this replacement is serving, and we need to be very careful or be very conscious of that. So the unlearning or the undoing collectively actually is a brilliant strategy to create consciousness around that.
There's just one other thing I was thinking about. I mentioned the post-war picture lending libraries where people could loan original works of art, and I can't imagine that an institution would allow people to take art in their homes and look after it in that way in these days. So I think there's also a question about trust and who we actually believe is qualified to be a caretaker for art. And I think there's a lot of things in that, but
And how do you kind of deal with that question in relation to the Temporary Custodians project, where you are asking for caretakers for the work? Is there a decision or an application process, or is it?
I think for me the artwork is the people and what they create between them, and the prints are a token that enables that to take place. And for me, it's kind of about trying to sort of almost devalue the artwork in a way so that it can be in the world. I think it's so high, so inflated in its value that we just can't possibly trust anyone to, even go near it. So it's so alienated from the world in a way. And I think there's a really big problem there with, how we imagine people are going to engage with it.
In this like industrial and post-industrialization process, the number of farmers has been like rapidly decreasing, while number of artists has been rapidly increasing. I mean, like here, artists include curator or cultural workers, etc. I think that change is telling something, and then how we need to how we need to intervene into the change. So like your work, Emily, also like telling, like, I mean, you're working with land, earth. I mean, from the image, who could see that as an art? Although we have a history of like land art.
We should open up as soon as possible, but I was actually very impressed by that picture that you mentioned of the loan scheme. And I thought the same as you kind of articulated here, which is, when there was, like, not how is that possible, when is that actually possible? And and for instance here, we actually received the grant before our time here 5 years ago to create a post to develop a picture scheme, but to generate income. And the same funding body that funds that doesn't fund when you want to engage with, let's say, asylum seekers, because it's not part of the realm, it's not part of the system to actually support engagement in that way. But if you want to corporatize your collection, then you actually have support in that scheme, in that same way. But actually that was really utopian. At least even just this picture was really beyond our mindset today. Yeah.
I just wanted to say, actually, before, probably about a year before you came, a couple of years before you came here, there was an art lending library set up on Teesside by artists, where artists would put their work into the library and then lend it out into the community. And everything came back, which was really interesting. But it's an interesting strategy to adopt in terms of ownership.
When I was a kid, my mum worked in a school that had a lending service. So I grew up with a real artwork in my house. And for us, it was like just one of the things in the house. But I think it's a really incredible model that should be more known about and used more widely. But I think it's worth just pointing out that also within the institution, there are other models of how to use collections, which is something we're interested in here, but it's not something that that is new. As Miguel said, many of the things we're doing are kind of going back to other models. And the collection here, one of the main strands is contemporary jewellery collection, which was actually work devised to be worn, used, held, and ever since it has been collected, it's been used in that way within the museum. Actually less so now than it was 10 years ago. So I think there are other ways of thinking about how collections held by institutions work as well. Not only having a kind of subsidiary or separate handling collection, but how do you work directly with artworks in these spaces as well as in a more distributed way.
Sorry, I just wanted to add something to that as well. In terms of I'm, probably as Maury knows, absolutely fascinated about the history of loan collections. And just as a very small aside, there's still one lending in Leeds. I'm not sure if it's linked to Leeds Art Gallery or not, but anyway, people who live in Leeds can actually borrow an artwork. And something that's kind of related to that is I've been looking at educational art collections. So one of the things I've been looking at is collections related to universities, and the idea that you can display art around, you know, a campus. So the campus kind of becomes an art gallery. Again, kind of a post-war thing. But one of the things that I'm really interested in is one of the places that still really actively pursues that is the University of Salford. But instead of sort of continuing to acquire objects, what they're actually doing is they're doing other stuff that's kind of in partnership. So they go out and they work with, you know, other galleries, other networks to actively kind of commission new work. So I think the idea of an artwork has shifted so much, basically. So it's really gone away from kind of a picture or something that you have on your wall to being something. So I think what you're doing now really is a lot more interesting, Maury, in terms of, you know, the people who own it create the artwork. For me, I think there's kind of a lot more power and resonance in that in a 21st century context than just having a picture that you stick in the wall in your house. And I think there's a really nice link back to the useful art as well, the kind of stuff that you have displayed downstairs here about, you know, people like Fiesta Gates kind of going out into a community to create the artwork, as opposed to, you know, sending something that we all think is an artwork into somebody's house. So yeah, that's kind of more sort of a comment and maybe a bit of an elaboration as well.
So on a kind of different point, Bina, I really loved the diagram of Casco or the institution as a sun with the staff and the ecosystem around it. And then if I followed it right, it was publics was something that emerged from it, like the rays of the sun, which is quite an interesting way of looking at it, because we always talk about working with or working for publics. But I'd just like to hear a bit more about that and maybe what others think about that as a model for working as an institution.
Downstairs in the exhibition, the New Idea Home, there's a work by Adelita Husni Bey, but actually it's not really work by Adelita Husni Bey. By a lot of people, or like a kind of anonymous almost. So it's called Use of Space, a convention, a legal document that was developed through, the first draft was developed through 5 consecutive series of public drafting meeting. So together with Adelita at Casco, that we invited like general activists, squatters, anthropologists, abolitionists, other lawyers to dwell on what we can do in relation to current housing crisis, in particular in the Netherlands, privatization of housing, and which was very clearly indicated by the criminalization of squatting. So like a lot of cultural spaces in the Netherlands actually stem from this like 30 years of squatting practice. Many of space were just set up in the squats, but a lot of them, like new ones, had to be evicted. So this kind of working process, kind of constituency, I find, how to say, like powerful articulation. But then problem there, which is something that we are discussing at Casco, is that to what degree that we are actually interfering into the reality. So the imagination of collective writing a legal document in order to intervene a legal system is a beautiful, encouraging, and learning process, but this really would go to the parliament and can change. And then institutions like us should continue to work on that project until it goes to the parliament, or we just see how it can develop and maybe have a certain viral moment, or it remains in a certain, like, this kind of imaginary level that also has a certain form of action. So, yeah.
I think if I understood what you were trying to say is well, I was going to use the one word that I just didn't say it properly in English yesterday, so I need to find another word. So the tension between UN as an institution enabling a process through which one artist with many other people, so referring to that example that Bina mentioned, is there's a poster downstairs that is credited to an artist called Adelita Unispe, but in fact it's the outcome of a long process involving many other people. So what you're saying is that, are you feeling a tension between you as an institution enabling something to happen, but still operating within a field which is not legal, it's like fictional, let's call it, let's say, imaginary. So doesn't really have an effect in the social world or in reality. And by that, when and how, or is it possible, or is it important, or should institutions actually operate beyond enabling things to happen, but really creating change in, let's say, in real world? Is that what you're referring to? Yes. Yeah.
One of the reasons that we want to work with the public and we want to have publicness is for change.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak on my personally, but I think I will also speak on behalf of the team here. It's one of the crucial questions we have, and also one of the crucial questions we are asked by others. I mean, I remember maybe 2 years ago, I was in a conference with many people, and one of the questions I was asked, and I was not even articulating things the way I can articulate today about what some of the stuff we do here, but people ask, so when are you stopping to be a museum and become a social service kind of provider? And I don't remember what I replied, but I guess I said something like, there's nothing that puts one against the other. There's nothing that from our viewpoint puts one thing against the other. That's like how you see it, or most people would see it, because usually we have a sort of hyper specialization of professions today, and so if you are a museum, you cannot be doing something that some others don't associate with being a museum, but you associate with being a social service provider or whatever. But here, yes, we feel it very much. I mean, for instance, when we opened the current displays downstairs 2 weeks ago, I quite remember that Alistair was still director here and he's leaving 2 months from now, but he's not here today, couldn't be. And when he gave his formal welcoming speech, he basically ignored the displays, and he talked about other projects that we want the displays to inform. And some of them are only ideas, some of them are more or less in course, in development, some might not even exist. And basically, yeah, whether or not they will effect change, some might to such a degree. And sometimes we have to deal with this situation in which, where is our energy being allocated to? And what kind of stuff can we actually do? I mean, we were installing, and on a Friday before the opening, on the Thursday before the opening, I was asked by a friend, a charity worker here, whether I could the day after, so the day before the opening, we were still installing, I could go and spend 2 hours translating interpreting a lady that came, is a newly arrival immigrant that just speaks Spanish, doesn't speak English, and she was having a social appointment with social services provider, and they needed someone to translate her. And I spent 2 hours or 3 hours of my morning and the day before the opening actually helping her doing that. And I don't know, maybe someone was waiting for me in the to install the show. I don't know. But that sounded more urgent and responsible to do rather than ignore. But where is the energy going? And I don't know. Sometimes we also face this, like, we cannot do everything. We're not equipped sometimes. We don't know how to do it. But sometimes we try to do individually or collectively things that somehow contribute to affect change, at least locally. And by working with someone like Emily, we actually are doing it. We still perform the function of the gallery of the town that works with the artists from here, although many other galleries would not work with artists from where they are from. And she actually does a lot of work that is how we might enable the work that we cannot do or we don't know how to do to be done in that sense. Unless you don't agree with me.
No, I do agree with you.
I think there's just one more question.
Hi, yeah, I was really interested in something that Bina was saying about how these acts of fairly small scale, like care and trust, might work simultaneously with these kind of incomprehensible, like, ecological crises that are going on at the moment. And that kind of struck me as something quite relevant to Emily's work as well, and I wondered if that's something you think about with regards to what you're doing, kind of working on a, like you were talking about geology, and that kind of thinking about scale, and I just wondered if you had anything to say about that, because I thought it was quite an interesting link.
In terms of clay as a material here, it's the last brickworks closed in the 1960s, and clay at the moment, at this point in time, is being put, it sounds ridiculous, but into landfill. So in order to build, because the clay can cause subsidence, it's dug out and removed, and then just placed somewhere else. So at this moment in time, this is a material which is being treated as a waste product. So one of the things that I do in my practice is look at how the clay could be reused. And we've talked about and used the kind of metaphor of the brick as a way of rebuilding. But actually what I'd be more interested in, and what I'm most interested in my practice, is that maybe I start a discussion and then somebody else comes along and goes, well, hey, I'm an architect. I'd like to look at using a rammed earth technique, or because I don't need constant control over this. It's not about that, I made this brick, so I'm the only one that can make bricks now. It's about actually saying, we need to use this. It's a product that's being treated as waste. It's a product that doesn't need to be treated as waste. And so, yes, that is therefore something I think about. But it's not up to me to then decide how it's going to be used, because I can't be everything either. But yeah, I hope that answers your question a little bit.
It's quite important, actually, there's a question or a topic, at least for discussion, because this land in this place has been built, let's say, the base for industry. So this land is fully contaminated since 150 years ago. This is probably one of the lands in the whole country that is most contaminated. And so somehow there is this nostalgia for this industry, this past, the industrial past, that somehow created the grandness of this place, but also created its failure as a community, or as a place, or as a site. And it's indeed interesting that you go and dig directly from, not just in the river, but also somewhere in central Middlesbrough, etc. And now, I never really thought about it, but how, like the Gresham, the picture that Emily showed, where she was actually digging the clay from, it's 5 minutes walking from here, and it's quite a demolished area. And exactly, it is like, there's nothing else that can grow from there. Only these shabby houses that are being demolished, and because it's a metaphor, or it's like a symbol of this contaminated space. And it's a life cycle. Yeah. And it's really important to look at it, I don't know, in terms of the identity of this place, like really thinking through these like almost like geological metaphors. But yeah.
Which is that Emily's work picks up on one of the original female industries and identities of this area, which is a very male-dominated identity in the kind of general imagination of the place. And that's really important, I think, that material of clay and that working with clay. Thank you.
About 7. Well, then I think we'll leave. Yeah.
I have to say that it's a great pleasure to have Bina here, and of course my other guests and all of you. But I really have to say that, you know, Cusco as a site, it's, let's say, it's not a very big institution. How many people do you have in your team? But it's a fundamental organization of the art sector and beyond. And we really learn a lot by going there and spending time there and seeing what they do. And just today the presentation was actually brilliant. Just those images, the way you articulate the thought process behind an organization that has been through change. But it's just, and everyone else here talked about what they had, and your presentation was brilliant, yours. But I really want to say this because it's really important that we understand the privilege that we had today by listening to them speaking. Okay. Yeah.
I'm so embarrassed.
And I'd just like to say as well, the series of talks in the program, I hope can bring more of that as well. So thank you for coming, and do look on the website for the next events, which is whenwetalkaboutwork.co.uk.
And the next one will be?
The next one won't be till January, on the 18th of January in Liverpool, and the theme is on conversation and exchange, but talking with children. And there'll be a speaker from Stavanger Kunsthalle in Norway, a design collective in Sheffield, as well as an artist and curator based in Liverpool, Polly Brannan.
And the cafe